past the creases or furrows. Judging from
Pump
the
is on underfloor heating
fragments,
speed
the
1
measure
now.
or bore of the lightning, if such a term may be used, must have been about 1 inch and a quarter. At Paris, Monsieur Hachette and Monsieur Baudin succeeded in making tubes, in most respects similar to these fulgurites, by passing very strong shocks of galvanism through finely powdered glass. When salt was added, so as to increase its fusibility, the tubes were larger in every dimension. They failed both with powdered feldspar and quartz. One tube, formed with pounded glass, was very nearly an inch long, namely 0.982, and had an internal diameter of 0.019 of an inch. When we hear that the strongest battery in Paris was used, and that its power on a substance of such easy fusibility as glass was to form tubes so diminutive, we must feel greatly astonished at the force of a shock of lightning, which, striking the sand in several places, has formed cylinders in one instance of at least 30 feet long, and having an internal bore, where not compressed, of full 1.5 inches, and this in a material so extraordinarily refractory as quartz. The tubes, as I have already remarked, enter the sand nearly in a vertical direction. One, however, which was less regular than the others, deviated from a right line at the most considerable bend to the amount of 33 degrees. From this same tube, 2 small branches, about a foot apart, were sent off, one pointed downwards and the other upwards. This latter case is remarkable, as the electric fluid must have turned back at the acute angle of 26 degrees to the line of its main course. Besides the 4 tubes which I found vertical and traced beneath the surface, there were several other groups of fragments, the original sites of which, without doubt, were near. All occurred in a level area of shifting sand, 60 yards by 20, situated among some high sand hillocks, and at the distance of about half a mile from a chain of hills 400 or 500 feet in height. The most remarkable circumstance, as it appears to me, in this case as well as in that of Drigg, and in the one described by Monsieur Ribbentrop in Germany, is the number of tubes found within such limited spaces. At Drigg, within an area of 15 yards, 3 were observed, and the same number occurred in Germany. In the case which I have described, certainly more than 4 existed within the space of the 60 by 20 yards. As it does not appear probable that the tubes are produced by successive distinct shocks, we must believe that the lightning, shortly before entering the ground, divides itself into separate branches. The neighborhood of the Rio Plata seems peculiarly subject to electric phenomena. In the year 1793, one of the most destructive thunderstorms perhaps on record happened at Buenos Aires. 37 places within the city were struck by lightning and 19 people killed. From facts stated in several books of travels, I am inclined to suspect that thunderstorms are very common near the mouths of great rivers. Is it not possible that the mixture of large bodies of fresh and salt water may disturb the electrical equilibrium? Even during our occasional visits to this part of South America, we heard of a ship, 2 churches, and a house having been struck. Both the church and the house I saw shortly afterwards. The house belonged to Mr. Hood, the Consul General at Montevideo. Some of the effects were curious. The paper, for nearly a foot on each side of the line where the bell wires had run, was blackened. The metal had been fused, and although the room was about 15 feet high, the globules, dropping on the chairs and furniture, had drilled in them a chain of minute holes. A part of the wall was shattered as if by gunpowder, and the fragments had been blown off with force sufficient to dent the wall on the opposite side of the room. The frame of a looking glass was blackened, and the gilding must have been volatilized, for a smelling bottle, which stood on the chimney-piece, was coated with bright metallic particles, which adhered as firmly as if they had been enameled. Chapter 4. Rio Negro, Bahia Blanca. Rio Negro. Estancias attacked by the Indians. Salt lakes. Flamingos. Rio Negro to Rio Colorado. Sacred tree. Patagonian hare. Indian families. General Rosas. Proceed to Bahia Blanca. Sand dunes. Negro lieutenant. Bahia Blanca. Saline incrustations. Punta Alta.
Right, so now
Zorillo.
underfloor heating speed 2.
July the 24th, 1833.
Yeah, underfloor heating speed 2.
The Beagle sailed from Mindanao.
The pressure drop before was minimal at speed 1. Even now at speed 2
This is the principal river on the whole line
negligible,
of coast between the Strait of Magellan and the Plata. It enters the sea about 300 miles south of the estuary of the Plata. About 50 years ago, under the old Spanish government, a small colony was established here, and it is still
So
the
this
most
is
southern
speed
position
2 underfloor
between
heating on a
41
pump.
degrees on this eastern coast of America, inhabited by civilized man. The country near the mouth of the river is wretched in the extreme. On the south side, a long line of perpendicular cliffs commences, which exposes a section of the geological nature of the country. The strata are of sandstone, and one layer is remarkable from being composed of a firmly cemented conglomerate of pumice pebbles, which must have travelled more than 400 miles from the Andes. The surface is everywhere covered up by a thick bed of gravel, which extends far and wide over the open plain. Water is extremely scarce, and where found is almost invariably brackish. The vegetation is scanty, and although there are bushes of many kinds, all are armed with formidable thorns, which seem to warn the stranger not to enter on these inhospitable regions. The settlement is situated 18 miles up the river. The road follows the foot of the sloping cliff, which forms the northern boundary of the great valley in which the Rio Negro flows. On the way, we passed the ruins of some fine estancias, which a few years since had been destroyed by the Indians. They withstood several attacks. A man present at one gave me a very lively description of what took place. The inhabitants had sufficient notice to drive all the cattle and horses into the corral which surrounded the house, and likewise to mount some small cannon. The Indians were Araucanians from the south of Chile, several hundreds in number, and highly disciplined. They first appeared in 2 bodies on a neighbouring hill. Having there dismounted and taken off their fur mantles, they advanced naked to the charge. The only weapon of an Indian is a very long bamboo, or chutho, ornamented with ostrich feathers, and pointed by a sharp spearhead. My informer seemed to remember with the greatest horror the quivering of these chuthos as they approached near. When close, the cacique, Pinchera, hailed the besieged to give up their arms or he would cut all their throats. As this would probably have been the result of their entrance under any circumstances, the answer was given by a volley of musketry. The Indians, with great steadiness, came to the very fence of the corral, but to their surprise, they found the posts fastened together by iron nails instead of leather thongs, and, of course, in vain attempted to cut them with their knives. This saved the lives of the Christians. Many of the wounded Indians were carried away by their companions, and at last, one of the under-caciques being wounded, the bugles sounded a retreat. They retired to their horses and seemed to hold a council of war. This was an awful pause for the Spaniards, as all their ammunition, with the exception of a few cartridges, was expended. In an instant, the Indians mounted their horses and galloped out of sight. Another attack was still more quickly repulsed. A cool Frenchman managed the gun. He stopped till the Indians approached close, and then raked their line with grape shot. He thus laid 39 of them on the ground, and of course, such a blow immediately routed the whole party. The town is indifferently called El Carmen or Patagones. It is built on the face of a cliff which fronts the river, and many of the houses are excavated even in the sandstone. The river is about 200 or 300 yards wide, and is deep and rapid. The many islands with their willow trees, and the flat headlands, seen one behind the other on the northern boundary of the broad green valley, form, by the aid of a bright sun, a view almost picturesque. The number of inhabitants does not exceed a few hundreds. These Spanish colonies do not, like our British ones, carry within themselves the elements of growth. Many Indians of pure blood reside here. The tribe of the cacique Lucani constantly have their toldos on the outskirts of the town. Footnote: toldos. The hovels of the Indians are thus called. Footnote ends. The local government partly supplies them with provisions by giving them all the old worn-out horses, and they earn a little by making horse rugs and other articles of riding gear. These Indians are considered civilized, but what their character may have gained by a lesser degree of ferocity is almost counterbalanced by their entire immorality. Some of the younger men are, however, improving. They are willing to labor, and a short time since, a party went on a sealing voyage and behaved very well. They were now enjoying the fruits of their labor by being dressed in very gay, clean clothes, and by being very idle. The taste they showed in their dress was admirable. If you could have turned one of these young Indians into a statue of bronze, his drapery would have been perfectly graceful. One day, I rode to a large salt lake, or salina, which is distant 15 miles from the town. During the winter, it consists of a shallow lake of brine, which in summer is converted into a field of snow-white salt. The layer near the margin is from 4 to 5 inches thick, but towards the center, its thickness increases. This lake was 2.5 miles long and 1 broad. Others occur in the neighborhood many times larger, and with a floor of salt 2 and 3 feet in thickness, even when under water during the winter. One of these brilliantly white and level expanses in the midst of the brown and desolate plain offers an extraordinary spectacle. A large quantity of salt is annually drawn from the salina, and great piles, some 100 tons in weight, were lying ready for exportation. The season for working the salinas forms the harvest of Patagones, for on it the prosperity of the place depends. Nearly the whole population encamps on the bank of the river, and the people are employed in drawing out the salt in bullock wagons. This salt is crystallized in great cubes and is remarkably pure. Mr. Trenham Rees has kindly analyzed some for me, and he finds in it only 0.26 of gypsum and 0.22 of earthy matter. It is a singular fact that it does not serve so well for preserving meat as sea salt from the Cape de Verde Islands. And a merchant at Buenos Aires told me that he considered it as 50% less valuable.
100 millibar.
Hence, the Cape de Verde
somewhere
salt
between
is
50 and
constantly
100 millibar
imported
now.
and is mixed with that from these salinas. The purity of the Patagonian salt, or absence from it of those other saline bodies found in all seawater, is the only assignable cause for this inferiority, a conclusion which no one, I think, would have suspected, but which is supported by the fact lately ascertained that those salts answer best for preserving cheese which contain most of the deliquescent chlorides. The border of this lake is formed of mud, and in this numerous large crystals of gypsum, some of which are 3 inches long, lie embedded, whilst on the surface others of sulfate of soda lie scattered about. The gauchos call the former the Padre del Sal, and the latter the Madre. They state that these progenitive salts always occur on the borders of the salinas when the water begins to evaporate. The mud is black and has a fetid odour. I could not at first imagine the cause of this, but I afterwards perceived that the froth which the wind drifted on shore was coloured green, as if by confervae. I attempted to carry home some of this green matter, but from an accident failed. Parts of the lake, seen from a short distance, appeared of a reddish colour, and this perhaps was owing to some infusorial animalcula. The mud in many places was thrown up by numbers of some kind of worm or annelidous animal. How surprising it is that any creatures should be able to exist in brine, and that they should be crawling among crystals of sulfate of soda and lime. And what becomes of these worms when, during the long summer, the surface is hardened into a solid layer of salt? Flamingos, in considerable numbers, inhabit this lake and breed here. Throughout Patagonia, in northern Chile, and at the Galapagos Islands, I met with these birds wherever there were lakes of brine. I saw them here wading about in search of food, probably for the worms which burrow in the mud, and these latter probably feed on infusoria or confervae. Thus we have a little living world within itself, adapted to these inland lakes of brine. A minute crustaceous animal, Cancer salinus, is said to live in countless numbers in the brine pans at Lymington, but only in those in which the fluid has attained from evaporation considerable strength, namely about 1/4 pound of salt to a pint of water. Well may we affirm that every part of the world is habitable, whether lakes of brine or those subterranean ones hidden beneath volcanic mountains, warm mineral springs, the wide expanse and depths of the ocean, the upper regions of the atmosphere, and even the surface of perpetual snow, all support organic beings. Footnote: Linnaean Transactions, Volume 11. It is remarkable how all the circumstances connected with the salt lakes in Siberia and Patagonia are similar. Siberia, like Patagonia, appears to have been recently elevated above the waters of the sea. In both countries, the salt lakes occupy shallow depressions in the plains. In both, the mud on the borders is black and fetid. Beneath the crust of common salt, sulfate of soda or of magnesia occurs, imperfectly crystallized. And in both, the muddy sand is mixed with lentils of gypsum. The Siberian salt lakes are inhabited by small crustaceous animals, and flamingos, Edinburgh, New Philosophical Journal, January 1830, likewise frequent them. As these circumstances, apparently so trifling, occur in 2 distant continents, we may feel sure that they are the necessary results of common causes. See Pallas's Travels, 1793 to 1794. Footnote ends. To the northward of the Rio Negro, between it and the inhabited country near Buenos Aires, the Spaniards have only one small settlement, recently established at Bahia Blanca. The distance in a straight line to Buenos Aires is very nearly 500 British miles. The wandering tribes of horse Indians, which have always occupied the greater part of this country, having of late much harassed the outlying estancias, the government of Buenos Aires equipped some time since an army under the command of General Rosas for the purpose of exterminating them. The troops were now encamped on the banks of the Colorado, a river lying about 80 miles northward of the Rio Negro. When General Rosas left Buenos Aires, he struck in a direct line across the unexplored plains, and as the country was thus pretty well cleared of Indians, he left behind him, at wide intervals, a small party of soldiers with a troop of horses, a posta, so as to be enabled to keep up a communication with the capital. As the Beagle intended to call at Bahia Blanca, I determined to proceed there by land, and ultimately I extended my plan to travel the whole way by the postas to Buenos Aires. August the 11th. Mr. Harris, an Englishman residing at Patagones, a guide, and 5 gauchos who were proceeding to the army on